Hi everyone, welcome back. We've got a brand new story to share with you. So let's begin. 17 years of marriage doesn't just end overnight, but sometimes it dies so slowly that you don't realize you're living with a corpse until someone finally decides to bury it. That's what happened to me, though I didn't understand the full extent of the decay until I came home from the hospital to find that my entire life had been systematically dismantled while I was unconscious on an operating table. My name is Brandon. Janet and I had been married since we were both in our mid-20s, young and optimistic about building a life together. For over a decade, we had what most people would consider a solid marriage. We bought a house, raised our daughter Lillian, built careers, and maintained the kind of routine that suburban couples fall into when they're focused on responsibilities. But somewhere along the line, something fundamental shifted in our relationship, and we began the slow slide from married couple to reluctant roommates. The change wasn't dramatic enough to point to a specific moment or event. The past 3 years had been particularly difficult. Janet and I barely spoke beyond what we needed at home and about bills. We slept in the same bed, but maintained careful distance, like two people trying not to accidentally touch each other on a crowded subway. Physical intimacy had disappeared entirely. Not just sex, but even the casual touches that married couples usually maintain. I suspected Janet was having an affair, though I couldn't prove it and hadn't caught her in any obvious lies. It was more a collection of small changes in her behavior that suggested her attention was focused elsewhere. She had started dressing differently, paying more attention to her appearance when she left the house. She would often take phone calls in other rooms, claiming they were work-related conversations that required privacy. She also claimed she needed space to maintain her individual identity. Most tellingly, Janet had become emotionally distant in a way that went beyond normal marital fatigue. She seemed uninterested in my day-to-day life, unresponsive to attempts at conversation, and generally checked out of our relationship. When I tried to address the growing distance between us, she would deflect or minimize my concerns, suggesting that I was being needy or unrealistic about what marriage looked like after so many years. I never found concrete evidence of infidelity, and I didn't know how to confront her without proof, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know the truth anyway. The main reason I stayed in our deteriorating marriage was Lillian, who was 16 at the time and focused on her senior year of high school. I didn't want to disrupt her final year at home with the drama and upheaval of a divorce, especially when she was already stressed about college applications and the transition to adulthood. I told myself that once Lillian left for college, Janet and I could have honest conversations about whether our marriage was salvageable or whether we should end it amicably. What puzzled me during this period was why Janet stayed in the marriage. I was the primary breadwinner, covering the mortgage, utilities, car payments, and most of Lillian's expenses, while Janet used her income from her part-time job at a marketing firm to cover her personal needs. But she could have afforded her own apartment with some lifestyle adjustments, and she clearly wasn't getting emotional fulfillment from our relationship. I wondered if Janet was staying for the same reason I was, to provide stability for our daughter. Or perhaps she was waiting for a more advantageous time to leave, when she could secure a better financial settlement, or when her relationship with whoever she was seeing became more serious. Either way, we were both going through the motions of marriage without any of the substance that made it meaningful. Lillian left for college in the fall, and the house felt even emptier without her energy and presence to distract from the tension between Janet and me. We settled into an even more distant routine, like two people sharing a hotel rather than a home. We would sometimes go entire days without speaking except for essential communications about schedules or household maintenance. Around this time, I finally decided to address a medical issue I had been postponing for several years. When I was 32, I had been in a car accident that resulted in injuries to my lower back and left leg. The immediate damage was repaired with surgery, but over the years, scar tissue and improper healing had created chronic pain and limited mobility that was getting progressively worse. My orthopedic surgeon had been recommending corrective surgery for 3 years, but I had delayed it because the recovery time would require several weeks away from work and significant restrictions on physical activity. With Lillian now settled in college and my work situation stable, I finally scheduled the procedure. I informed both Janet and Lillian about the upcoming surgery, explaining that it would be a significant procedure followed by an extended recovery period. Lillian was concerned about missing classes to visit me in the hospital, but I assured her that the surgery was routine and that she should focus on her studies. Janet's response was more muted. She acknowledged the information, but didn't ask many questions about the procedure or recovery timeline. The surgery was scheduled at City General Hospital. I drove myself to the hospital for the 4-hour procedure, which went according to plan. The surgeon was able to remove the problematic scar tissue and repair the damaged nerves that had been causing most of my chronic pain. When I woke up in recovery, Janet was there briefly to confirm that everything had gone well, but she left after about an hour, saying she had obligations she needed to take care of. What none of us had anticipated was that the surgery would reveal additional complications that required immediate intervention. The surgeon discovered that the original injury had affected more nerve pathways than previous scans had shown, and a second procedure was necessary to prevent long-term damage. This surgery was performed 2 days later, followed by complications that required pain management specialists and an extended stay for physical therapy. What was supposed to be a 5-day hospital stay stretched into weeks. The additional procedures and recovery time meant I was essentially bedridden for the first 2 weeks, followed by intensive physical therapy to regain mobility and strength. The pain medication made me groggy and disoriented for much of this time, and the physical therapy was exhausting and uncomfortable. Throughout this extended hospital stay, Janet visited exactly once, the day of the original surgery. She never returned to check on my condition, never brought personal items I might need, and never stayed to talk with doctors about my progress or discharge planning. Her absence was noted by the nursing staff, who would occasionally ask if my wife would be joining me for important medical discussions. I told myself that Janet's absence wasn't particularly surprising given the state of our relationship. We hadn't been emotionally supportive of each other for years, so why would this medical crisis be any different? I was hurt by her lack of involvement, but I also understood that she might not want to pretend to care more than she actually did. In some ways, her honesty about her disinterest was preferable to false concern. My daughter Lillian called several times a week to check on my progress, and I kept those conversations brief and positive to avoid worrying her. I had a few visits from colleagues and one close friend who had known Janet and me for over a decade. He seemed surprised that Janet wasn't more involved in my care, but he didn't comment directly on her absence. After 20 days in the hospital, I was finally cleared for discharge. The surgery had been successful, and while I would need several more weeks of outpatient physical therapy, I was mobile enough to manage basic activities at home. I was still weak and sore, moving slowly and carefully, but excited to sleep in my own bed and return to some version of normal life. My friend picked me up from the hospital since Janet hadn't responded to messages about my discharge date. The ride home was uncomfortable because sitting for extended periods still caused pain, but I was looking forward to the familiarity of my own space and the privacy to recover without hospital routines and constant interruptions. When he pulled into our driveway, everything looked normal from the outside. The house appeared exactly as I had left it weeks earlier, with no obvious signs of disturbance or change. My friend helped me with my bag and offered to stay for a while to help me get settled, but I assured him I could manage and wanted some time alone to readjust to being home. I unlocked the front door and immediately knew something was wrong. The entryway, which should have contained a coat closet, umbrella stand, and small table where we kept mail and keys, was completely empty. I stood in the doorway for several seconds, trying to process what I was seeing. My first thought was that we had been robbed while I was in the hospital. I moved slowly through the house, and the extent of what was missing became clear. The living room was stripped of furniture. The couch, coffee table, entertainment center, and bookshelves were all gone. The dining room table and chairs had disappeared. In the kitchen, the appliances remained, but most of the dishes, cookware, and small appliances were missing. Moving upstairs was difficult with my limited mobility, but I needed to see the bedrooms. Our bedroom had been cleared of Janet's belongings, her clothes, jewelry, personal items. but also of shared furniture like the dresser and nightstands. My clothes remained in the closet, but everything else that could be moved had been removed. Lillian's room appeared untouched, which confirmed that this wasn't a random burglary. Someone had selectively removed items, leaving behind things that clearly belonged to me while taking everything that could be considered shared property or that had any significant value. I checked the front and back doors carefully, looking for signs of forced entry, but the locks were intact and showed no damage. Whoever had entered the house had used a key, which meant this wasn't a break-in in any conventional sense. I tried calling Janet's cell phone, but the call went straight to voicemail without ringing. I left a message asking her to call me immediately, explaining that I had come home to find the house emptied and needed to understand what had happened. I tried calling 3 more times over the next hour, with the same result each time. My next step was to check our joint checking account online. When I logged in, I discovered that the account had been cleared out. Janet had withdrawn the entire balance we kept for monthly expenses and emergencies. The last withdrawal had been made just 3 days earlier, while I was still in the hospital. I spent the next several hours searching the house for any explanation or communication from Janet. Finally, I noticed a single piece of paper on the kitchen counter, folded once and placed under a salt shaker. The note contained one sentence written in Janet's handwriting. "I can't do this anymore. Don't contact me." That was it. After 17 years of marriage, Janet had disappeared while I was unconscious in a hospital bed, taking most of our shared possessions and leaving behind a note that wouldn't have been adequate to end a casual dating relationship, let alone a marriage with shared property and a child. I spent that first night alone in the house, sitting on the floor of what used to be our living room, trying to process what had happened. The physical discomfort from my recent surgery was manageable compared to the emotional shock of discovering that my wife had essentially evaporated while I was helpless to stop her or even be aware of what was happening. 3 days later, a courier delivered divorce papers to my door. Janet had filed for dissolution of marriage, citing irreconcilable differences and requesting division of marital assets. The papers had been prepared by an attorney I didn't recognize, and they included a request for me to vacate the house within 30 days so it could be sold and the proceeds divided. The coldness and calculation required to plan this sequence of events while I was recovering from surgery were staggering. Janet had clearly been preparing for her departure for weeks or months, timing it precisely for when I would be unable to interfere or even be present to witness what she was taking. I filed a police report, hoping that Janet's actions might constitute theft or some form of criminal activity that could be addressed through the legal system. The responding officer was sympathetic, but explained that since Janet was my wife and the items she had taken were marital property, this was a civil matter rather than a criminal one. Unless I could prove that she had taken things that belonged exclusively to me, the police couldn't treat her actions as theft. The officer's explanation made sense legally, but it felt wrong morally. Janet had waited until I was at my most vulnerable moment to dismantle our shared life, taking advantage of my physical incapacity to avoid any confrontation or negotiation about our separation. The timing felt deliberately cruel, designed to maximize my shock and helplessness. I called Lillian to inform her about what had happened, being careful to present the facts without editorial commentary about her mother's behavior. Lillian was stunned and hurt that Janet hadn't discussed her plans with her before disappearing. She confirmed that she had no advanced knowledge of her mother's intentions and hadn't been contacted by Janet since my surgery began. Lillian offered to come home from college to help me deal with the situation, but I insisted that she stay focused on her studies. There was nothing she could do to change what had happened, and I didn't want her academic performance to suffer because of her parents' failed marriage. With the house stripped of furniture and necessities, I wasn't able to stay there comfortably while recovering from surgery. My friend offered his guest room, and I accepted gratefully, packing what remained of my belongings into a few boxes and leaving the empty house behind. I hired a family law attorney recommended by a colleague to review the divorce papers and advise me on how to proceed. He was experienced in contentious divorce cases and immediately recommended hiring a private investigator to document Janet's current living situation and financial status. The private investigator was able to confirm what I had suspected for years. Janet had indeed been having an affair, and the relationship was serious enough that she had moved in with her boyfriend immediately after leaving our house. More significantly, he discovered that Janet and her boyfriend had left the country together just days after she cleared out our home. This information confirmed that Janet's disappearance had been planned well in advance, while I was focused on my medical treatment. My attorney advised me to sign the divorce papers and proceed with dissolution as quickly as possible. Fighting Janet's terms would be expensive and time-consuming, and given that she had left the country, enforcing any favorable judgment would be difficult anyway. The faster we could finalize the divorce, the sooner I could move forward with rebuilding my life. What Janet didn't understand when she executed her carefully planned escape was that I had been preparing for this possibility for much longer than she realized. While I hadn't anticipated the cruel timing of her departure, I had suspected for years that our marriage would end in divorce, and I had taken steps to protect myself financially. Over the past 3 years, as our marriage deteriorated and I became convinced that Janet was involved with someone else, I had quietly moved most of our significant assets into accounts and investments that she didn't know existed and weren't tied to me. I had been careful to maintain our standard of living and meet all our shared expenses. But I had also been systematically protecting the wealth I had accumulated through years of careful investing and financial planning. Janet knew about my salary and our joint checking account, but she had never shown interest in our overall financial picture or long-term investments. This disinterest had allowed me to redirect funds into accounts that were legally hidden. I had also acquired some assets in our daughter's name, like a small rental property, that were purchased and managed without her knowledge. From Janet's perspective, our net worth consisted primarily of the house, our joint checking account, and the furnishings and personal property she had taken. She believed that by clearing out the house and emptying our shared account, she had taken approximately half of everything we owned together. In reality, the items she had taken and the money she had withdrawn represented less than my actual net worth. The furniture could be replaced easily, and the money from our joint account was pocket change compared to the investments and assets I had protected from our eventual divorce. I had even gone so far as to document apparent financial struggles over the past year, mentioning to Janet that some of my investments had performed poorly and that I was concerned about our long-term financial security. This performance was designed to lower her expectations about what assets would be available to divide in a divorce, and it had apparently been successful. The process of replacing everything Janet had taken was more emotionally difficult than financially challenging. Having to buy new furniture, dishes, linens, and all the basic necessities of daily life felt like starting over from scratch at age 45. But I was able to afford everything I needed without strain, and within a few weeks, I had created a comfortable living space that was actually more to my taste than the compromised decorating decisions Janet and I had made together. The hardest part of the entire experience wasn't the theft of my possessions or even the end of my marriage. It was the realization that Janet had deliberately chosen to strike when I was at my weakest moment. She could have asked for a divorce at any point during the previous 3 years when I was healthy and capable of participating in discussions about our separation. Instead, she had waited until I was sedated and helpless, using my medical crisis as an opportunity to avoid any accountability for her actions. This timing revealed something about Janet's character that I hadn't fully understood during our marriage. She wasn't just someone who had fallen out of love or found happiness elsewhere. She was someone who could plan and execute a deliberately cruel betrayal without apparent conscience or regret. The divorce was finalized 4 months after Janet's disappearance, with minimal contact between us throughout the process. Our assets were divided according to what she believed existed, giving her half the value of the house and the items she had already taken. She never learned about the investments and property I had protected, and my attorney advised me that I had no legal obligation to disclose assets she hadn't specifically requested in discovery. Lillian maintained limited contact with her mother after the divorce, though their relationship was permanently damaged by Janet's failure to communicate her plans or consider the impact on our daughter. Lillian spent holidays and school breaks with me, and we developed a closer relationship than we had maintained during the turbulent final years of my marriage. A year after the divorce was finalized, I had completely replaced everything Janet had taken and had created a life that was significantly more peaceful and honest than the final years of our marriage. I was no longer living with the constant tension of suspected infidelity or the emotional exhaustion of trying to maintain a relationship with someone who had already checked out. Looking back on the experience, I realized that Janet's cruel timing and method of leaving actually provided me with valuable clarity about her character and our relationship. If she had asked for a divorce during a normal period, I might have spent years wondering whether we could have saved our marriage with counseling or different choices. Her decision to abandon me while I was hospitalized eliminated any ambiguity about her priorities and values. The experience taught me several important lessons about protecting yourself in a failing marriage. First, financial preparation for divorce should begin as soon as you suspect your marriage might end, not when divorce papers are filed. Second, people who are capable of having extended affairs are also capable of other forms of deception and betrayal, so you should plan accordingly. Third, the legal system provides limited protection against cruel or unethical behavior between spouses, so you need to protect yourself proactively. Most importantly, I learned that being financially and emotionally prepared for the worst-case scenario isn't pessimistic. It's practical. Janet's plan to leave me with nothing while I was helpless failed because I had anticipated her potential for deception and had taken steps to protect myself years in advance. For men who suspect their wives of infidelity or who are living in marriages that feel unsustainable, my advice is to start protecting your assets immediately while continuing to meet your family obligations honorably. Don't wait for your wife to ask for a divorce or for the situation to reach a crisis point. Begin quietly securing your financial future while hoping that you'll never need the protection you're creating. Janet thought she had taken everything from me, but she had actually freed me from a marriage built on deception and given me the opportunity to build a life based on honesty and authenticity. Sometimes the cruelest betrayals are also the most liberating, even when they don't feel that way at the time.